Hey there and welcome back! So after our big project in the last section, we will now actually move from the ES5 JavaScript version to ES6 or even newer for the rest of the course. So remember that we talked briefly about JavaScript versions right in the beginning of the course. And so from now on, it's time to really dive deep into next generation JavaScript. And don't forget that everything that you learned up until this point is of course still valid and still very important, because all that really changes is a bit of syntax and some new features, but not really how the language works, okay? So in this section you will learn what's new in ES6, so that in the next section we can then create a new, huge project using modern JavaScript. Welcome back. So in this lecture we're going to get a quick overview of what's new in ES6 or ES 2017, which is actually the official name. But everyone just calls it ES6 simply because it came right after ES5. And so that's what I'm going to do for the rest of the course. So before we start, just a quick recap of what we already talked about right in the first section. So right now we have all these modern JavaScript versions that we can use in production as long as we transpile and polyfill the code back to ES5, right? And I'm going to show you how to do exactly that in one of the next sections, okay? So we're actually going to use ES7 and ES8 also in the next sections, but for now I want to start by really focusing on ES6 in this section. Because remember, that's the version that brought us a ton of updates and new features to the language. And so here is what we're going to cover in this section. So we'll start with the two new ways of declaring variables in JavaScript, and that's let and const, and then move on to blocks and ifs, new string methods, and then arrow functions, which is a huge and amazing topic. After that, we're going to talk about destructuring, new array methods, the spread operator, and rest and default parameters, before we finally move on to the big and important topics of maps, classes, and subclasses. Now, there are two other extremely important ES6 features that we're going to talk about a bit later, because they need some more background knowledge, and that is promises for dealing with asynchronous JavaScript and native JavaScript modules to separate our code into different files. Okay? Alright, and that's it for the intro. Let's now move on to the real coding. Let's start with one of the most simple and straightforward changes in ES6, which is the two new ways of declaring variables, which are going to replace the var declarations that we've been using so far. And these are let and const. So this is the starter project for this section that you can download from the course from this section as always. So we will continue with our persons examples throughout this section, since we're already familiar with these. And don't worry about these colored boxes here on the right side. We're just going to need them for some examples later on, okay? So how do we use let and const? First of all, in all of the lectures during this section, I will usually start by writing some code in ES5 and then show you how to do it in ES6 and where the big differences are. So let's do that. Let me just start by writing that this lecture is about let and const. Okay, so I'm going to start with the ES5 code, okay? And let's just say we want to declare a name. And we've done that a lot of times, so we already know we use var in ES5 and the name. And I will call it name5 because this one is for ES5, and then later I'm going to use name6, okay? Because we cannot duplicate these names, so we need two different variable names. So Jane Smith, and let's say her age is 23, and we then change that name to Jane Miller. So imagine that Jane married someone with the last name of Miller. So we can simply mutate this name variable here, right? So let's console log this. And you will understand why I'm doing this in a second, okay? So let's console log this and see what happens. And of course, we see Jane Miller here. Alright, so let's now write the same thing in ES6. So instead of var, we can now choose between const and let. And const is for constants, which means for values that we don't want to change, and let is like the old var. So this is for values that we actually want to change or mutate later on. So let's declare the name as a constant. And so we use const name, and I'm calling it name6 for ES6. And I'm going to call her again Jane Smith. And now the age. And since we know that the age can change, we're going to use let, right? So now Jane is 23, but next year she's going to be 24, 25, and so on. So this is something that can mutate, and so we use let. So age 6, 23. All right. Let's now suppose again that Jane wants to marry and change her name. So if we now say name 6 should be Jane Miller, and then console.log the result of that, such as we did before, let's see what's gonna happen. So we get an error here, assignment to constant variable. And that makes sense, right? Because as I said, this const keyword here is used to declare constants, so variables that are immutable, which we cannot change. And if we then attempt to change the value of a constant, it gives us this error here. Okay, so again, in ES6 we no longer use var, but instead we use const if we have a variable that's not going to change its value over time, and we use let if we want to change the value of the variable. So we now have a way to declare constants. But that's not the only thing that's new with let and const. And that's because variables declared with var in ES5 are function scoped, but variables declared with let and const in ES6 are block scoped. Alright, so function scoped and block scoped. And that's a huge difference. So let's see what that actually means with a new example. So I'm now going to write a simple driver's license function, okay? So just that we have something different here. And I'm going to start again with ES5. So function driver's license. And we are going to do something if the person passed a test, okay? So we say if passed test, then the first name is John, and that's actually not right, and the year of birth is 1990, and then we want to console log this. Okay, so this may not be the most realistic example really, but this is just to show you something, and you will see in a second when we write the ES6 code. Okay, so don't worry. So now let me just console log this. First name, let's say born in, and of course year of birth. Is now officially allowed to drive a car. So let's call this function actually. And we say that the person passed the test, so we pass true into the function. And let's see what happens. Okay, first we of course have to comment out this part of the code here, so that it doesn't get in our way. Okay, and now of course this printed out to the console just right. So let's now do the same function for ES6. Let me just change this here to 5, and then I'm going to copy it, and here's also 5. ES6, and 6 and 6. Okay. Here we can use a let instead of a var. Okay. Because let's assume that the first name can also change. So let can be a good change here. And then for the birth year, of course, that cannot change, right? It's impossible that you change your birth year. So this will be a constant. And now, of course, if we print it to the console, it will work, right? But now it's time to see why let and const are different from var. So let's change this line here, where we actually use these variables first name and year of birth out of the if statement. Okay, and put them here. And then do the same thing in here. All right. And let's see what happens right now. Okay, so we get an error here in line 41, which is this one. So the first one worked just fine. This console log, of course, worked because we can use the first name and year of birth variables here in the same driver's license function, right? But in here, it's different. We get an error saying that first name is not defined, which is strange, right? But that's because with let and const, the variables are not function scoped, but block scoped. So what is a block? A block is simply all the code that is wrapped between these curly braces here. So each time that we have an if statement or a for block or a while block, we're actually creating a new block. And the variables declared with let and const are only valid, are only accessible by the code that are inside of the same block. So if we move outside of the block, which is what we did here, then we no longer have access to these variables that are here. So this is similar to what we had before with functions, right? So with the var keyword, it works differently. We have access if it's in the same function, right? If we now moved out this console log to outside of the function, then it would also no longer work. Because the variables declared with var, as we learned throughout this course, are only accessible inside of a function, but not from the outside. So this is not going to work, right? So we have this error here. So let's move this back and come back here. So this really is a bit different from what we were used to do up until this point, right? So again, we now no longer have access to the variables created inside of a block, which is this one here in this case. Because these variables are now block scoped and no longer function scoped. So suppose we wanted to use these variables here outside of the block, then we would just do it the way that before we did it with functions. So we can declare these variables outside of the block, which before we did outside of the function, and then define the variables in here. So let's say first name and const year of birth. And so now in here we can simply define them and then it should work. Or does it? Because actually this also does not work. It only works for the let declarations. So we simply cannot define a constant here in a block and then use it outside of that block. If we really want to use this constant outside of the block, then we have to declare the constant out here. And then of course it's gonna work. So now it works again. So we declared the first name variable here outside of the block, but didn't define its value and then defined it in here. And that's why we can then use the first name variable outside of the block, which is the exact same thing that we used to do with functions before, right? So this really is a huge difference between what we had before. But that's not even all. Suppose we would use a variable here before we actually declare it. So let's say we say console.log of the first name. So do you remember what this is going to print out to the console? And I really hope that you do. And alright, it's undefined. And that's because in an execution context, all variables are hoisted and set to undefined, right? And so if we then use them like this before we actually declare and define them, we get undefined. Now in here, it doesn't work quite like that. So let's say we wanted to use the first name variable in here. So let's see what that gives us. And now we get a first name is not defined error. So now we can effectively not use a variable before it was really declared. And I actually think this is a good thing because it may prevent some errors. Now this happens because of something called the temporal dead zone, which basically just means that the variables are actually hoisted, but we still cannot access them before they are declared. So this is just a technical term, but what you need to know is that we can only use a variable after we actually declared and defined it. Okay, and just to finish this, let's just take a look at maybe a bit more practical example, all right? So let's say that in our code, we were using an I variable, okay? So let I be, let's say 23. So this was just a normal variable that we were using in our code, okay? And now suppose we have a for loop, okay? And we usually declare a variable in here, which is a counter called I, right? So I was the variable that we used all the time, so let's also use it here. So we say I start at 0, and this should go on before I equals 5. So as long as I is less than 5, and then I should be incremented. So this is all nothing new for you, right? And then we just console log all of the i's. Okay, and then after that, we also console.log I out here. Remember, which is the variable that we had up here, all right? And before we can run this, let me just get rid of this line so that we don't have that error. And so let's see. Okay, so we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which are these console logs, and then I is 23. So assigning other values to I in here, in this for loop, doesn't change the I variable that we had defined here with the let. And again, that's because these variables are block scoped. And so this I variable here is a completely different variable from this one. So they happen to have the same name, but it really doesn't matter because they are separate variables. It's like having var I inside of a function and var I outside of a function. So these would be also two completely different variables, right? And now here with the block in ES6, it's exactly what happens as well. So I here is a completely different variable in this block than this I here in this other, let's say, block. So if we had var instead, let's just very quickly test this out. What do you think would I be? And that's right, it would be 5. Because these variables are of course not block scoped. So this is now not a different variable. And so this 23 here will be overwritten, and then in the end we have the final I from this counter variable here. So I really hope this makes sense and that you understood the main differences between var, const, and let, okay? So as a conclusion of this lecture, if you want to start using ES6, then the best practice is actually to use let for variables that will change their value over time, and const for variables that cannot be reassigned, so that are constant throughout our code. In this lecture, I'm going to show you a new way of creating ifs, using the concepts that we just learned in the last lecture. So in the last lecture, we saw that variables declared using let and const are block scoped. And this means that these variables are defined inside of a block, and from the outside of that block, they are not accessible. Now, what does that sound like to you? Yeah, that's data privacy that we've been talking about a lot during our big project, right? So up until this point, we always used immediately invoked function expressions for that. But it looks like in ES6 we have a new, much simpler way of achieving data privacy. Because all we have to do is to use a block. So let's see how. Now a block is not restricted only to if statements or for loops or while loops. So we can also just write a block like this. All we have to do is to use curly braces and then create some code inside of these, and we just created a block. So let's now create a constant in here. So const a is 1, and then let's also create b2 using a let statement here. So it doesn't make any difference just to use both of them here. And if we now were to console log these two here, console.log, let's say a plus b, then what would we get? Alright, we have an error here, and that's because these values are not accessible from outside of the block. So again, they are block scoped and not function scoped. So what we have here now is exactly like an IFI, right? Like an immediately invoked function expression. So we created some data here that is not accessible from the outside. And it's much easier to write it like this, right? Remember, an IFI in ES5 would be written like this. So ES5, we had to do all this work and write it like this, just to create a simple variable that's not accessible from the outside. And then we also have to call this function, right? So if we do console log now, okay, and let's get rid of that. Then of course we have our error here, right? So that was the old way. So this is ES6. Now let's just try to add var here, okay? So var c equals 3. And what's gonna happen then? And of course you know the answer, right? So again, let's get rid of this. And now of course we see 3. And that's because for variable declarations with the var keyword, it doesn't matter if they're inside of a block or if they're not inside of a block, because they're not block scoped, they're function scoped. Alright, so this is a very simple change that you can do if you want to start writing ES6 code. So if you have a simple IFI like this that you need to write, you can very simply switch to doing it like this. So this is very simple and very straightforward once again. Alright, so let's now move on to the next feature of ES6. Hey there, welcome back. There are big improvements on how we handle strings in ES6. So let's now take a look at the major changes that happened in strings. So let's start by creating some data here that we can work with. So let's define a name. And we do so using the let definition, okay? So we're already using the new ES6 version here to declare our variables. Smith, okay? And then this one is going to be a constant. So the year of birth is a constant because, as we saw before, it's something that really cannot change, right? Okay, and we also can create a function here. And we already know this one. It's a calculate age function. So calc age, it gets a year, and it simply returns the current year, let's say 2016, minus the year that it receives as an input. Alright, so the first thing that I want to talk about is template literals. And that's probably the coolest new thing about strings. And I really love this new feature because it really makes our life easier when working with strings. So imagine that in ES5 we wanted to put all of these data together in a big string. So let's say console.log. So this is the first name. Then we have to use all of these plus signs like this. And for me personally, I find this really annoying. So first name and then the last name. So John Smith. And it goes on and on. So he was born in, now this plus sign again, year of birth. So today he is, and now we can also calculate the age here. So of course we use calc age and then his year of birth. Years old. So this was quite some work, right? So let's check it out in the console. So yeah, this is John Smith. He was born in 1990. Today he's 26 years old. Let's just clear this here. This part was from before. So again, this is our string now. So again, this is a bit hard to write, right, with all of these plus signs, and it gets really confusing. So in ES6, we have a very cool new thing, which is called template literals. And it works like this. In order to use them, we now use backticks instead of the quotation marks that we used before. So backticks are these symbols here, all right? So we use these ones instead of the quotes that we used before, or the single quotes, right? So we now use backticks. And this tells JavaScript that we want to use a template literal. And now we can write all of our text and put the variables right inside of the text. And this is how it works. So let's write the same sentence again. So this is, and now we simply can do it like this. So this, let's say $sign here, and then the curly brackets. And now we just have to say first name. And that's it. Now last name. Okay. So let's tag this before we continue. And alright, this is John Smith. So now we don't have to use all of these annoying plus signs and starting and stopping the strings like we did here. So all we have to do now is one big string which starts and begins here with a backtick. Okay? So let's continue our sentence here. So he was born in, and once again we do it like this, in year of birth, and today he is. And we can actually not just put variable names here, but entire expressions. So we can calculate his age right here inside of this template string. So once again, we can use the calc age function here, and it's gonna work just fine. Years old. So now we have the same sentence as before, hopefully. And yeah, it's exactly the same. So this was much quicker, right? And much easier to write. So this is probably one of the easiest and most straightforward things to implement right away when you start using ES6. And it's a huge advantage, in fact, over ES5. So this is template literals, but there's more. So in strings, we also have now a couple of new methods. So we talked about some string methods back in our budget project, but now we have some more new string methods. So let's take a look at them. Let's first start by creating a new string, and I'm just going to call it name, or n actually, which is just going to be John Smith. And now we already know how we do that, right? So we just say first name space last name. All right, so let's now use some of the new methods on this string. So the first one that I want to show you is called starts with. So we can just say n dot starts with, and then, for example, we can say j, and this is then going to return if the string starts with j or not. And actually, to see this, we have to console.log this, right? So let's see, true. Of course, because remember, this one here is John Smith, and of course, it starts with a j. If we would put an n in here, it would actually be false. And also, a small j is also false, because it's not the same letter. I mean, it's also a j, but it's not a capital J. So JavaScript identifies this as something else. Okay, and such as we have start with, we also have ends with. So let's just duplicate this line with Command D, and then ends with. So let's test if our string ends with th. And remember, it's called John Smith, so we should get true, right? So it makes sense. If we once again say something else, let's say something like this, then of course we have false. So we can test if a string starts with something or if it ends with something. So what about the middle of the string? For that we have includes. So we can ask if the string includes something. So let's, for example, ask if the string includes a space. And what do you think? Of course it's true, because remember, and we can check it out here by writing n, it's John Smith. So of course there's an s in here. Or if we test O, let's say if there's an O in the string, and yeah, we also get true here, right? So these are three very useful methods that are now included in ES6. Okay, and just one more, which is the repeat method. So let me also console.log something here. And what I'm going to do is simply say first name dot repeats. And then we can say how many times we want it to repeat. So let's see. Okay, it's not a function, and actually it's repeat and not repeats. Okay, so my mistake. But now here it is. So John, 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 John. 5 times in a row. Now imagine we want a space in there. Then we would have to write a template literal. Just like this. Okay, so John, 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 and John, John. So it doesn't look much useful in this case, but there are some cases that we need it, and that's why it was also added to the new version of JavaScript. Alright, and that's it with strings in ES6. For me personally, the best thing here is the template literals, so I really like them. Alright, so let's now move on to another very important feature that's also very useful, and that's arrow functions. So come with me right to the next lecture. Let's now talk about arrow functions, which are yet another very cool addition to JavaScript. So suppose that we have an array with a couple of birth years and that we want to calculate the age for each of these years. So basically we would have const years. Okay, remember that whenever we have a value or a variable that's not going to change over time, we use the const to declare that variable. And in this case, this is totally the case. So just some random years here, 1982, and let's say 1937. Okay, so remember we can use the map method to loop over the array and then do some stuff with it. And that's how we do it in ES5. So again, we start with ES5 here and then move on to ES6. So in ES6, we would use var to declare a variable, right? So ages, and I'm going to call it ages5 because it's for ES5. And now we can say years.map, and you remember all of this, right? So we have our callback function here, and then our code inside of this callback function. And remember that here in the map method, we have access to the current element, the current index, and also the entire years array. So I'm just going to call it L, which stands for element here, okay? And if we then return something here, which will be 2016 minus the element in this case, it then gets stored into this array that we specified here. So this is how the map method works. So nothing new in here. Let's just simply console.log this array so that we can see that everything works. Alright, so these are the 4 ages. Now in ES6 we have a more beautiful and quicker way of writing this part here of the code. So this callback function. So let me show you how. ES6. So now I use the const keyword and I call it ages6 years.map, and now comes the difference. So now we can use an arrow function. And how does the arrow function work in this case? Well, it's just like this. Element, then the arrow function 2016 minus the element. And that's it. So let me explain it to you. So here we have the argument, here we have the arrow operator, and then here we have what we have here in the return statement. So this one here is going to produce the exact same thing as all of this piece of code up here. So for a simple callback function like this here with only one argument, it really is as simple as this. So there's no function keyword, no return keyword, no parentheses, no curly braces. All we need is the argument, the arrow, and then what we have in our return statement. So it really is as simple as this. And you see how much easier it is for us to write code like this, right? So we have to write a lot less code. Just to make sure, let's also log this one, just to show you that it really worked. And here it is. So it produces the exact same result, and we write a lot less code. Now, if we have more than one argument here, we actually have to provide the parentheses. So let me show you an example of that. So ages 6. And now remember, we cannot change a constant, right? So let's change it here to let. All right. And so now it's a normal variable that we can mutate as we want. And let's now write it in a different way. So years.map. And once again, remember that we have access to the current element, the current index, and the array itself. So now I want to access the element and also the index. And so I have 2 arguments. And so, as I said before, I now have to use these parentheses here. So element and index. And then let's use the knowledge that we gained before in the last lecture, which are these template literals. So we're going to put a string in here saying age element index, or actually index plus 1, why not, is simply, and remember that in here we can even have expressions like this. So like 2016 minus the element. And so that's it. So now we used 2 arguments here, and therefore we had to use these parentheses here. Okay. Let's just console.log ages again. So age element 1, age element 2, 3, and 4. So that's the small change that we have to do when we have 2 arguments. Now, if we have more than one line here, in this return part here, let's say, actually it's just this one here. So if we have more than this line, we also have to use the curly braces that we have to use in normal functions. And also the return keyword is then not implicit, and we have to write it again. So let's see an example of that as well. And I'm gonna call it ages6 again, because why create new variables here, right? So again, the same arguments, and I skip the parentheses here. All right, and again, I want more than one line of code, and therefore I need to use these curly braces. So let's create a variable here, which is the current year. All right, so that it makes sense that we have more than one line. And I'm sure that you know by now how to get the current year, because we did this in our project. All right. And we can also calculate the age here outside. So let's say now minus the current element, and then let me return the string that we had before. So this one here. And remember that in this case, I actually have to write out the return statement here, the return keyword. Now here I want age, and that's it. Okay. And here we go. So it worked again. So there are three ways of writing arrow functions. The first one is with one argument in one line of code, and that's the simplest form. If we then add another argument, we need to use the parentheses. And if we then add more lines of code, more than one, then we have to use the curly braces and the return keyword at the end. All right, so this is how arrow functions work. And I'm absolutely sure that you see how useful they can be, right? But there's even more to arrow functions. That's not all. So let's move on now to the next lecture to learn all about it. Welcome to the next lecture. Let's continue with arrow functions and see another reason why they are so useful. So maybe the biggest advantage of using arrow functions is that they share the surrounding this keyword. So this means that unlike normal functions, arrow functions don't get their own this keyword. So again, arrow functions do not have a this keyword. They simply use the this keyword of the function they are written in. And so we say that they have a lexical this variable. So let's now see how we can actually use that to our advantage. And now we're going to use one of these boxes here for the first time. So let's write an object with some properties, and then we will have also a function which will attach an event handler to this box here. Okay? So let's do that. And once again, I'm going to start by writing the ES5 version of this. So let's call this object box and box 5. And we're going to say the first property is color, and it's green. Okay, so we're talking about this very first box here, okay? This, of course, is a comma. The position of that box is number 1. All right, so it's the first one. And then we also want a method here called clickMe. And let's just add a function. All right. Now what we want this method to do is to simply attach an event handler to this element here. So let's just quickly jump into our HTML file and see that it's this one. So it's with the class of green, okay? So how do we add an event handler? We say document.querySelector, right, to first selected element, and then add event listener. And we want this to happen on a click because that's the easiest one. And then we add our callback, right? And we actually want something very simple here. All we want is to have an alert which says the color of the box, so in this case green, so it's stored in here, and the position which is stored here. So let's start by creating a string. So I'm just going to call it string str. This is box number. And since we're writing ES5 here, I'm actually going to do it entirely in ES5. And so I'm going to use the plus sign here instead of the template literal. Okay, so I say this dot position. So box number 1. And it is, and then the color. All right. And then we can alert this string. Okay. So let's now call this method. So box5 dot click me. And as soon as this method is executed, is called, the event listener will be added to this element. So let's reload this. Now, do you think that this is really gonna happen the way that we intended it to work? Let's check it out. So I'm now going to click on this box here. And it says, this is box number undefined and it's undefined. Okay, so why is this happening? Why is it not reading or values from this object here? So green and 1. And the reason for that is something that I said in the very beginning of the course. And that is that only in a method call, the this keyword actually points to that object. But in a regular function call, the this keyword will always point to the global object, which in the case of the browser is the window object. And that is exactly what happens here. So this click me method is a function attached to an object. So it's a method. And so in here, we have access to the color and the position by using the this keyword, right? But then this callback function that we have here in this event handler here is not a method, it's a regular function call. And therefore the this keyword here does not point to this box5 object, but instead it points to the window object. And of course, position and color are not defined in the window object. Therefore, what we have here is undefined for both of these. So some say that this is a bug in JavaScript, and others say that this is actually how it should behave. Now, a very common pattern to avoid this is to simply create a new variable in here and store the this variable in that new variable. So let's try that out. So let's say var, and we usually use a variable called self or that, and I prefer to call it self. And so we simply say self equals this. And then the self variable points to this. And so in here, instead of using this, we use self. And then we basically stored the this variable here in this new variable so that we can then use it in the rest of the function. So this is kind of a workaround, kind of a hack to avoid this situation that in this function call here, we don't have access to the box5 object. Okay, so let's now run this again. Click here, and now it works. Now it says this is box number 1 and it's green. All right, so remember that in the beginning I said that with arrow functions, they actually share the surrounding this keyword. So let's see how we can use arrow functions in order to avoid this hack here, right? Let me just go ahead and copy all of this. Actually, there's no need to write it all again. So it's ES6 now. I'm going to call it box 6 and call box 6 here. And now it's not a var, it's a constant. So let's say const. And we don't use this. Okay. Because now what we're going to do here is to use an arrow function instead of this anonymous function here. So let's get rid of this. And remember that when we don't have any arguments, or if we have more than one argument, we have to specify the parentheses. So we do that, then the arrow, and then our function body, which is this. And it's actually as simple as this. So now in here we have a function that shares the this keyword with its surrounding. So with the click me method here. And we know that in here, the this keyword points to the object. So now in here, we can actually use the this keyword, right? So let's get rid of this one here. And let's run it. And I'm going to click now. And here it is. So this is box number 1 and it's green. So now, by using the arrow function, we really have access to the this keyword of this method here. Because again, the arrow function shares the lexical this keyword of its surroundings. So if you want to start using ES6 and arrow functions today, then the best practice is to actually always use arrow functions when you need to preserve the value of the this keyword, such as we did here. So using arrow functions here was very useful, right? Let me just show you another scenario here. Let me copy this again and get rid of this one. And this is still ES6, let's call this 66 now, okay? So in here we still have a function that we could potentially replace with an arrow function, right? And it's this one. So if I, instead of this function expression, I wanted to write an arrow, I could simply do it like this, right? It would work the exact same thing. But let's see if the result is still the one that we want. So reload, and now I click here, and now it says undefined again. And why is that? And it's actually very simple. It's because this method here does now also share the lexical this keyword from its surroundings. And the surrounding of this is the global context, right? So this means that this method here also no longer has its own this keyword. So it shares the global this keyword, which of course points to the global object window. So this is the same situation as right in the beginning. We don't have position and color in the window, right? And therefore it becomes undefined. So this is not something that we want, but I just wanted to show you that you have to be really careful with these arrow functions so that you don't lose track of what the this keyword actually points to. So I will just comment this one out because it's not really interesting for us. So again, I just wanted to show you to be careful. Alright, and since this is one of the really great new things in JavaScript, let me just show you another example, because I really like these arrow functions. So we'll have another example here. Let's create a function constructor in order to create a person object, okay? So once again, we've done that a lot of times before, so you already know how to do this. And I'm going to keep it very simple just with the name. So this .name is of course the name. And let's now add a method to the prototype property of the person, so the objects created through the person function constructor inherit this method. So once again, nothing new here. So person.prototype property, and then let's say my friends. And once again, it's my friends 5 because we're using ES5 in this case first, so that I can show you the first example with ES5 and the second one with ES6. So this is a function which actually receives an array of friends. And what we want to do here is to simply return an array which says that the name of the person is friends with each of these elements that are in this friends array, right? So imagine that the person is John and that the friends are Bob and Jane. Then we want to say John is friends with Bob and John is friends with Jane, okay? So let's create an array. Simply call it R, and then we're going to use the map method that we used before once again, and this time here on the friends array. Alright, so you already know that we could use the arrow function here, but since I'm writing ES5, I'm just going to do it this way. So we have access to the current element, and so I'm going to call it EL, which stands for element. And so in each element of this array, all I want is to say the name of the person is friends with, and then of course the current element, which is called EL. Okay, and then we simply can console.log the array. All right. Let's now create a couple of friends. Bob, Jane, and Mark. Let's say that should be enough for now. So let's create a new person called John. And then we can call right away the myFriends5 method. And we're going to pass the friends into it, of course. All right. So again, do you think that this is going to work? Take a deep look at this method here and see if the this variable will actually point to what we think it points. Okay? So let's now run this. And actually, something weird happens. So the name is not defined. And this is because of the exact same reason as before. So in here, in this method, we of course have access to the this variable, and it points to the name of the person. So it would be John. But the thing is that in here we call another function, right? Which is this anonymous function. And so in here, the this keyword is not going to point to the object, but instead it's going to point to the global object, which is window once again. Now we could again use that trick that we used before by saying var self equal this. So basically storing the this variable in a separate variable. But I just want to show you another cool trick that we could use here instead. So remember that we have the bind, call, and apply methods, which we can use to set the this keyword, right? Remember that part? So call, bind, and apply allow us to define the this variable manually, and bind creates a copy of this function, while call actually calls it immediately, okay? So what we can do here is to create a copy of this function with the this variable set to this. So this here is the function, right? And so in this function, we can create a copy of this function using the bind method right here. So what we want the this keyword in here to be? Exactly, we want it to be this. So this maybe sounds or looks a little bit weird, but this is actually going to work. Because remember, here outside, we still have access to the this variable, and it points to the new person. So in this case, it would be John. And so we can basically pass it into this function here, simply by creating a new copy of the function with a manually defined this keyword. So let's check if this works now. And yes, it does. So John is friends with Bob, with Jane, and with Mark. So this is the ES5 version. And you still learned a very cool trick with this bind here, right? All right, and now the ES6 version. And once again, I'm going to copy it and just modify some stuff. So this one is called myFriends6. And then in here, we can change the content of our method. Now I want you to go ahead on your own and change everything here so that we no longer need this trick here. And I'm sure that you can do that by now, right? So please pause the video and do that right now. So I'm sure that you managed to do it. So let me show you my solution. So of course we use an arrow function here, right? And we actually don't need any of this, right? Because we simply have one line of code. So what I'm going to do is copy this, delete all of this, and just paste it back here. And another thing that we can do is to use a template string, which is way cooler than doing it this way. So get rid of all of this. So I'm missing the backticks here, okay. And here we go. So now we have transformed this to an arrow function. And so, as you learned before, this function does not have its own this keyword, and therefore we share the lexical this keyword from our surroundings. And the surroundings is, in this case of course, this method, where the this variable points exactly to the point where we want, which is the instance that we create. So let's create a new instance, and then the this keyword will point to it. This time let's call it Mike, okay, and then friends 6 here of course, and let's see that it's gonna work. And actually it doesn't, and that's because I didn't copy the new operator, right? So we were simply doing a function call with the person instead of creating a new object. So let's try it again, and now it works. Mike is friends with Bob, Mike, Jane, and Mike, Mark. Okay, so once again we use the power of the arrow function here. So I hope that these two lectures were enough to really convince you to start using the arrow functions. I hope that everything makes a lot of sense to you up until this point, and if it does, then let's go right now to the next lecture, which is going to be about destructuring, so another new concept in ES6. So let's move on. Let's now talk about something called destructuring. So destructuring gives us a very convenient way to extract data from a data structure like an object or an array. So imagine that we had an array filled with some data and that we now wanted to store each of the elements of that array in a single variable. So let's start again with doing it in ES5, right? And let's first write our array. So a very simple array, just with the name and the age of John, okay, and 26. So if we wanted to store each of the elements in a separate variable, we would simply have to write one variable for each element, just like this. So the name, and it's the first element of John, so 0, and then a variable for the age, and John 1. Okay, so now we have both elements in separate variables. Now imagine that we had like 5 or 10 elements in that array, then it would become a bit impractical to do this every time like this, right? And so in ES6 we have something called destructuring once again, and it would work like this. So ES6 now. So with destructuring we can destructure a data structure just like this. So we create a new variable, and then in here we put name and year, and then we put our array in here, so John and 26. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a constant called name and a constant called year, and then this data will be stored in each of the variables. So let's actually check that. So console.log with the name and with the year, and actually should be age. Okay, so let's check it out. Okay, the problem here is of course that I already used the variable called name before, right? So let's just get rid of this, and now it's gonna work of course. Okay, so again we destructured this data structure here using this kind of syntax here. So it's like the opposite of constructing a data structure. So with this here we build a data structure, and then with this syntax here we destruct it. And this actually also works with objects. So imagine we had an object, simply gonna call it obj. So first name and last name as usual, right? And now destructuring works in the exact same way. All we have to make sure is that the keys actually match with our new variable names. So let's do that. it's an object, and so we use the curly braces here, of course, because the object is also constructed like that. So that's also how we destruct it, okay? So we write first name and last name. And remember that these keys here have to be the exact same thing here. So these new variable names have to match the keys. Now we just say object. And that's it. Now we created two brand new constants which store the data out of the object. Let's just very quickly check that. First name and last name. And here we go. Now, if we don't want the variable names to match with the key names, then we can also use different names. And it's going to work simply like this. So again, we use the curly braces. Then we say first name A. For example, if you want the variable to be called A, and then last name B equal object, and that's it. So let's just quickly see if we have the same. And yeah, again, it's John Smith here. Okay, so this is how destructuring works. But let's now see a more practical application of destructuring. And a very good application is to actually return multiple values from a function. So in a more easier way than we used to do before. So at ES5, usually if we had more than one value that we wanted to return from a function, we would simply return an object. But now with destructuring, it got a bit easier. So let's try that out. So let's create a function that returns the age of a person as well as the remaining time for retirement. So we used that before, but now we're going to use both of these concepts in the same function, okay? So function calc age and retirement. And that's based on a year that we input. So const age. So let's now create a new date here, okay? So that our year is always up to date. So get full year instead of simply using 2016 or something like that. So instead of hard coding it here, minus the input year. So let's now return both of the age and the years until retirement. And so we simply return an array with these data. So age and then 65 minus the age. So supposing that 65 is the age at which we can retire. Could be something different, but let's assume it's 65, okay? So we used that before, and so that's how we do it here. All right, so this returns an array, and now all we have to do is to use destructuring in order to store this into different variables. So we want age and retirement. And this is of course the result of calling the function with, let's say, 1990. So we're now going to have two different return values. Let's just take a look at them. Age and of course the retirement. Okay, so we have already used a variable called age. Let's just call it age2 here. It really doesn't matter, right? Okay, and now it works. So these are the two return values that come from our function. So destructuring is a good solution for this particular case, and we're actually going to see more applications of destructuring, at least one more later in the course. So stay tuned and come with me right to the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at arrays in ES6, because a lot of things were added to arrays. We now have a lot of new methods and also a new kind of loop. So let's dive right into this lecture. And we're actually going to use all of these colored boxes now here in this lecture. So let's start by selecting them. And we're going to save it in a constant. And of course we use document.querySelector all. Let's first take a look now at the HTML. And we see that all of them have this box class name here, right? So let's use that one to select them. So box. Now we already know that this querySelectorAll method does not return an array with these elements, but instead it returns a node list. You remember that one, right? So what we have to do is to transform it into an array. And what we always did in this course was using this weird trick where we called the slide method on the array prototype and setting the this variable to the boxes in this case, right? So in ES5, this is how we would do it. So boxes array and 5 for ES5, we would say array.prototype and then use the slice method and then call it with boxes. So you remember this part, right? And so now we have an array, and now we can use all of the array methods. So let's say we wanted to change all of these boxes here to blue, okay? So like this blue color here. So we can now use the for each method. So boxes array 5 dot for each and our callback function. And here I'm going to write it the ES5 way. So the current element, and I want to change the style, the background color to this blue color, which is called Dodger blue. So this is a CSS color name. Okay, and that's it actually. So let's test this out. And nothing changed. And yeah, it's because I misspelled here this word. So it's called Dodger blue, okay? So just like this. And yeah, so now they're all blue. But we had to use this hack here, right? And so there's actually a better way now in ES6. So let's get rid of this code and write it in ES6. So boxes array 6, and now we have a new method which is called from. So all we have to do is say array dot from and then boxes. And what this is going to do is to simply transform this node list here that we have in boxes to an array. And it's as simple as that. And so now we can say boxes array 6 for each. And now I'm going to use the arrow function. Okay, so I want the current element and I want to change its style. To Dodger blue. And I hope it's correct this time. And yeah, it works. And since this is actually so short and simple, we can even take this from here and do it like this. And so we went from all of this code here to doing the same thing in just one line of code. So this new from method here makes our code a bit shorter and it also looks better. All right, so let's now talk about loops. So usually when we want to loop over an array, we use the for each or the map method. And they usually work just fine, right? Now, the problem with them is that we actually cannot break from them. And we can also not use the continue statement. So if we want to use the break or the continue statements in a loop, we cannot use for each. And we can also not use map. And so we would use a simple for loop in ES5, which forces us to write a lot of code just for a very simple loop. So suppose that we wanted to change the text here in the boxes, okay? Because now this box is no longer green and this is no longer orange. So let's say that we want to change the text from this box and from this box. So if we're in a loop, we can simply say that here in the second box, we want the loop to continue and not to do anything. So let's start by writing that the ES5 way. So as I was saying, we use a simple for loop here. So you already know how this works, right? Boxes array 5, and it's not active because I commented out this code here, right? Okay. Dot length and I++. So this is nothing new at all for you. And now all we have to do is to say that if it's this second box here, then we want to continue the loop. So let's check it out. And the class name of this one here is box blue. So we cannot simply say just blue, but instead we have to say that the class name is box blue. So let me show you how we can do that. So we say that if the boxes array at the current position, so position I, the class name, and I'm not sure if we already used that in the course, but I think we didn't. So this is a great time to learn this new property. So with class name here, we can retrieve the name of the class, of course, and then perform this kind of check that we have here. So in this case, to see if this element has the box blue class on it. And if it does, then we want to continue. Okay, and I'm sure that you remember the continue and break keywords from the beginning of the course. So what the continue will do is to simply skip this iteration of the loop and go right to the next one. And the break keyword will break this loop, and then we don't continue to the next iteration. So if we would use break here, then we simply would break the loop and it would stop here and not continue. Okay, but in the other cases, we simply want to change the text. So boxes array 5, and of course we need to select the current box, and then text content, and let's say I change to blue, which wouldn't make much sense on the second one because it is already blue. So let's see what happens here. Okay, so I changed to blue, nothing changed here, and I changed to blue. Let me just show you what happens with the break. Okay, and so in this case, only the first one would change, and then as soon as we hit the second element, it would break from the loop and not continue. Okay. Now, I really don't like to use the for loop like this. We have to write all of this code here, which always seems a bit repetitive. And then to select each element, we always have to write it out like this. And so in ES6, we now have a new loop. And this new loop combines the easy to use for each with the for loop. And this new loop is called the for of. So instead of for, it's called for of. So let's take out this code and write it the ES6 way. And here is how the for of loop works. So for, and then in here we can create a new variable, a constant for example, and then such as we do in the for each method, we can define our current element. And we can call this whatever we want. We can say current or element or whatever we want. And we say that this is an element of the boxes array 6. And that's it. So this is a simple loop where we can define the current element rather than having to do all of this weird code here. So again, this combines the very easy to use for each or map method with the for loop. So and then in here, we can also use the continue or the break statement, which we cannot in map or for each. So let's do the same thing that we did before. So if boxes array, and actually we want 6, let me see if it's active here. Oh, it's actually not, because I deleted that variable. So let me just add it back here, okay. So boxes are 6. Alright, just because we need this variable here later on. So dot class name equals box blue. Then we want to continue. Okay, and now let's just copy this part here so we don't have to write it all over again. But here it's now the simpler cur. Or it could be even simpler like C or whatever we want. Now this here is actually not correct, because what we want is the class name of the current element, right? Not of the entire boxes array. So this was a mistake. So let's now check it out. And yep, it worked just like before. This one changed and this one changed. The one in the middle just stays the same. So we went from this a bit more confusing and bigger code to this one here. And in here, we can actually do a little bit better, because now we have these new string methods. And so what we can do here is to use the includes method. So I hope you remember that one from one of the previous lectures. So includes, and we can now say blue. And remember that this one is gonna return a true if the class name contains the name blue. And so this way, we don't have to write here the entire class name, because we're just interested in the blue part. So this makes it even a bit better and more readable. And so you also just saw a good application of this new includes method. And of course, it still works. So this was of course a very simple example, but it's really important to show you that sometimes we might need the break or continue statements in a loop. And in this case, the new for off loop here comes in very handy. Alright, and just to finish, there are also two new and very useful array methods that allow us to find elements in an array. So up until this point, we only had the index of method, right? But now there are a couple of new ones, and I'm going to show you two of them, which are the best ones in my opinion. So suppose that we have a group of children and we know that only one of them is of full age. So let's now find out who and how old that person is. So again, we start with ES5. Let's say the ages of these children were 12, 17, 8, 21, 14, and 11. That's not quite 11. Okay. So the ES5 way, we would first have to create a Boolean array to determine whether each element of the array is younger or older than 18. And we could then use the index of to determine the element that we want. So let's use the map method to create an array with true or false values like this. So full age, which I'm going to abbreviate as full, and then ages.map. Okay, and I want the current, of course. And all we need to do here is to return if the current element is older or equal to 18 years. Okay, let's just check this. So false, 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 true, and false, false. So only this one is true. But now we have to find out the position of this element here in the array. And in order to do that, we use the index of method. Index of, and we want the one that is true, right? And in order to see this, let's use console.log again. And here we go. So it's element number 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. And if we want to now see how old the person is, we need to retrieve that exact element from the array. So ages, and then to retrieve. And now we need to again calculate the position of that element that's true. And so the person is, that's right, 21 years old. So that's a lot of work, just for this very simple task, right? And so in ES5, once again, our life is made easier with a couple of new methods. And these new methods are the findIndex and the find methods. So in ES6, let's now start by using the findIndex method. And this method, we can pass a callback function into it, and it's then going to return us the index of the array where the callback function returns true. So it's just like this. So ages.findTheIndex. And then this works a bit like the map or the for each methods. So we have a callback function that has access to the current element, to the current index, and the entire array. And so I can write cur, then my arrow function, and then what I want is the same expression that we had before, which is when the current is greater or equal to 18 years old. So what this does is to basically return the index for the element in which this expression here, so this callback function, returns the value true. And that's as simple as it. So let's actually console.log this result to see if it's the same as here. And yes, it is. So it's number 3. And if we actually want to retrieve the element and not just the index, then we could do something very similar. Instead of having to write it like this way here, so the array and then retrieve the value, now we have a simple method that does all of that automatically. So ages, find, and then this part here is of course the same. So if you don't want to know the index, we actually don't even have to calculate it. So we could just use this one if all we are interested in is to find the value that is greater than 18. And that value is 21, of course. So a lot of new and very useful stuff about arrays. These are great additions to the new standard of JavaScript, so to ES6. All right, so see you in the next video. Hey there! In this video, I'm going to show you a new operator in JavaScript, and that's the spread operator. So the new spread operator is a very convenient way to expand elements of an array in places like arguments in function calls. So let me show you what I mean by expand elements. Let's first create a simple function which simply adds for values, let's say for ages. So function add for ages. And I'm going to call them A, B, C, and D. And we simply return the sum of all of these elements, plus C and plus D. Alright, so let's now test if this actually works. Sum1, because I'm going to use this multiple times, so I'm going to start with sum1. So add 4 ages, and let's say 18, 30, 12, and 21. Okay, and then I'm going to console log this sum. Okay, and it's 81. Now imagine that we had these 4 numbers in an array instead of, for example, 4 different variables. So how would we pass that entire array into that function? So let's start with ES5. And the first thing is, of course, to create the ages array. So 18, 30, 12, and 21. Now remember that we have the bind, call, and apply methods. And we used the bind and the call methods already, but we didn't really use the apply method. And remember that the apply method, what it does is to receive an array. And it calls the function that the apply method is used on using the elements of the array as the arguments. And so we're going to make use of that here. Okay, so let me show you how that works. So now it's sum2, and we say add for ages, and then we use the apply method. And remember, we have to specify the this variable as well, such as in bind and call. But we're not really interested in that, and so we can just say that it's null. Okay? And then we pass ages into here. And so once again, what the apply method will do is to take this array and then call this function here using these elements of the array as the arguments, which is exactly what we want to do here, right? Because again, this function doesn't receive an array, but instead it receives these 4 arguments here. So let's now see if sum2 is also 81, which it should be. Sum2. And alright, so this worked. But once again, there is a better way of doing this in ES6. And it's as simple as this. So now I'm going to call it mag3. And we now are going to use the spread operator. So add 4 ages and the spread operator and then simply ages. And that's it. And this is what expanding means. What this operator here does is to expand this array into its components. So in this case 18, 30, 12 and 21. So this here is now exactly the same as writing 18, 30, 12 and 21, such as we did here in this case. So this is what the spread operator does. And now we're just gonna test it. And this is of course not max3, I don't know why I did that. So it's sum3. And now it should be 81 again, and it is. So of course, this method here works exactly the same, but here it's more easy to write, more easy to read, and also to memorize. So instead of using this apply and null, you can simply use the new spread operator to call this function like this with these arguments. And there are actually more use cases, for example, for joining arrays. So imagine that we have 2 arrays. One is for the Smith family. So going back to our person examples here. And so we have John, Jane, and then Mark. And we have an array for another family. Let's say Miller. And in here we have Mary, Bob, and Anne. Now to join these 2 arrays, we can once again use the spread operator. So now it's a big family. And so we say that we want to spread the family Smith and the family Miller. So what this does is to expand this array into the 3 single elements. It basically takes them out of the array and puts them here. And the same of course with family Miller. And just to make sure that it works, so here we have the array with all of the elements. And we can also just put another element here in the middle, for example, or somewhere else. Let's say that there's a new element like a new child. Then we can of course put it right here like this. And now here it is. And yet another use case is that we can actually use this on other structures, so not just array, but for example also on a node list. So remember, the node list is what the query selector all returns. So let's see an example of that. So I'm going to select this heading here, okay, and then the boxes, and then I want to change the text color of all of these 4 elements to let's say to purple. So I'm going to start with the heading, so h document query selector, and it's an h1 element. So let me show it to you. So it's an h1 element. So I'm not going to select it by class or by ID, but simply by its element name. And so we don't need the point or the hash symbol here. Okay, and now we also want the boxes. And we did this one before, so it's just like this. And now we could, of course, change the text color of this element and then loop through all of these here and change the text colors as well. But it's easier if we simply put all of them in the same structure, right? And so we can use the spread operator here once again, because remember, they don't only work on arrays, but also on other structures like node lists, which is what we have here. So let's do that. I'm going to call it all, and then we want H, and we want to spread the boxes. Okay, because H is not a node list, it's simply a node, because it's a query selector and not query selector all. But in here we have this node list, and so we use the spread operator to expand it, and then we have the 4 elements all here stored in this node list in the all variable. And so now all we need to do is to transform this node list into an array, and then we can loop through it with the for each method. And as we learned in the last lecture or one of the previous lectures, it's very easy to convert the node list to an array, right? So we simply write array and then from, which is the new method, and all, and this returns an array. And so now on this we can use, of course, the for each method. And we want the current element, and now I'm sure that you're already getting used to this new syntax that we've been using all the time now, which is the arrow function. So the current is the argument to the function, and now what we want to do is to change the style of each of the elements. So current.style.color, which is the CSS property for styling text colors. And now I simply use the CSS color name purple. And that's it. That's all we have to do to change all of these colors. So let's see, and it works. So they're all purple now. Not very beautiful, but that's not what matters here, right? So these were a couple of use cases for the new spread operator, and I hope that you see how useful it can be. So now let's move on together. In this lecture and the next one, we're going to talk about function parameters. So let's start with REST parameters right in this lecture. So REST parameters allow us to pass an arbitrary number of arguments into a function and use these arguments in that function. So in the last lecture, we've been looking at the spread operator, right? Now, REST parameters look exactly the same, but they are very different. So they use the same notation with the 3 dots, but actually REST parameters are the exact opposite of the spread operator. And that's because the spread operator takes an array and basically transforms it into single values, while the REST parameters receive a couple of single values and transforms them into an array when we call a function with multiple parameters. Okay, but enough talking, let's now see a practical example of this. So suppose we want to create a function that receives an arbitrary number of years and then prints to the console whether each person corresponding to these years is of full age or not. And once more, I'm going to start by doing it the ES5 way and then show you how the REST parameters work in ES6, making our life a bit easier. So in ES5, let's create a function called is full age and then 5. Okay, and in ES5, if we want to receive an undefined number of arguments, then we simply don't define any parameters for our function and then just use the arguments keyword. And remember, the arguments keyword or variable is very similar to the this variable, and it's a variable that each execution context gets access to. So let's first of all log this arguments variable to the console to see what it looks like. And arguments. Okay, so again, just like this is a special variable that we have access to in all functions. So let's say we want to call this function with 3 years, like 1990, 1999, and 1965. So let's see what happens now in the console. And now we have a small error here, but that's simply because I forgot the 5 here. Okay, so again, and so this is the arguments variable. And we see that it actually looks a bit similar to an array, but in fact it is not an array. So it simply says object here and not array, right? So all of the arrays have the array function constructor as their prototype, which is not the case here. And so arguments is not an array. We say that it's an array-like structure, but it's not really an array. So if we want to use it as an array, for example, to loop through it, then we need to first transform it to an array. And we already know how to do that with our little hack, right? And so we say var args array should be array dot prototype dot slice, and then call it with the arguments. Right? So that's what we did a couple lectures earlier. So now we're ready to loop through this array. And remember, what we want to do here is to calculate if each person is of full age. So it's very simple. We of course need to create a callback function here, and we use current, and we want to log to the console. So 2016, or the current year, minus the current value is greater or equal than 18. And that's it. So remember, the current is of course the current element of the array, and the array comes from the arguments. So all of these numbers that we pass into the function, which are in this case our years. So with this, it's actually going to work already. So let's check, and yeah, so it does work. So we have true, false, true. So the first person is of full age. This one born in 1999 is not, and this one is of full age too. So let's try it with a different number of arguments. So I'm going to add 2 more years here, let's say 2016 and 1987. And let's check it again. And so these are the first 3 coming from this function call, and these 5 here come of course from these. So we have true, false, true again, and then false, true. So this person of course is not of full age, and this one is. And if we wanted to add 100 arguments here, then it would work with 100 arguments of course. So this is how we do it in ES5. But let's now take a look at rest parameters in ES6. So ES6. And we're going to write a similar function, but make use of rest parameters. So is full age 6. And now, instead of not having any arguments, we use the rest parameter operator. And as I mentioned before, it's the exact same as the spread operator. So again, we have the 3 dots. And then we say the name of the variable. And so what this is going to do is, as soon as we call the function, it will transform the arguments, for example, these 3 arguments, or these 5, it will transform them into an array and then pass it into this function. And we can then access that years array automatically in a function and use it as we did before. So let's do that now. So let me first do exactly the same that we did before. So I'm going to call a function, and I'll show you what the years looks like. Let's just deactivate this function call here and take a look at this. All right, so this is years, And now we see that this is actually an array. So that is very handy, because now we don't have to do all of this, so we don't have to transform anything into an array, because we already have the array. So now all we have to do is to do that console log that we did before. So we can say years for each. And here again, we're going to use the arrow function and say that we want 2016 minus the current year and check if it's greater or equal to 18. And here we go. So this is the same function as before, but making use of REST parameters, which makes our code shorter and easier to read. And just to make sure that it works, okay, nothing happened. And that's of course because I forgot to write the console log here. So console.log, of course, and now it's gonna work. So close it here, and all right. So true, false, true. And if we now added these numbers, these years that we had before, let's say 2016, 1987, then of course it works the exact same way. So the big difference between the spread operator and the REST parameters is actually the place in which we use each of them. So the spread operator is used in the function call, while the REST operator is used in the function declaration to accept an arbitrary number of parameters. So I hope that the difference between the spread operator and REST parameters is now crystal clear to you. So if it is, then let's take this one step further and make the REST parameters even more useful, okay? So what I'm going to do now is to comment out this code and copy it, because we're going to do some changes here. So let me just copy this and put it back here. Because now what we want to change is to accept another parameter which will act as the age limit. So instead of having the 18 here, we will pass a parameter which is going to tell us at which age a person becomes full of age. So imagine it would be 21 in some countries, then we would need the 21 here. So we simply add a limit, and now we need to add a parameter in here because it's only one parameter. And it's one that we really know that we need. So we need one and only one limit here. Now the problem is that this limit here will also be part of the argument, right? So imagine that we now call this function with, let's say, 21 here as the limit, then this will obviously also be part of the argument's keyword, which is not what we want, of course, because here in this argument and in this array, we actually only want the years. And how would we do that here in ES5? It's actually pretty simple, because this slice method here can help us with that. Because remember, what the slice method here does is to allow us to cut a piece of an array. So if we now simply add the number 1, what this means is that it's going to start cutting at position number 1, or basically it will start to copy a part of the array. Or in other words, at position 1 it will start to, let's say, to copy our array. And so like this we can exclude the first argument. So to make this more clear, let's again take a look at the arguments, and then let's console log also the arguments array. Okay, so we have 21, 1990, 1999, and 1965, which are all of the arguments that we pass. And then our arguments array is the same thing but without the 21. And that's because we only started copying at position number 1. So in here, so 1, 2, and 3. So that's what the slice function does. And so we can handle, let's say, a usual parameter plus a number of arbitrary parameters, which are in case these 3. Then all we have to do is to here change it to limit, and we're good to go. So now we don't need this console.log anymore. And so here we have true, false, true, such as we had before. But now suppose that the age limit would be 16, then all of them would be of full age. So we had 3 times true. So you see, adding an argument here to our ES5 function makes it even more complicated. But in ES6, it's nothing like that. All we have to do is to add the limit, and then here we have our rest parameters. So this makes it very clear and very easy to use, because there's nothing we have to change. So all we have to do, of course, is to change this to a limit, and now we're good to go. And we could add as many parameters here as we wanted, and then say with this part here, that here we have an undetermined number of arguments. So if we now add 16 here, and get rid of this, then we have true, 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 false, true. So it's different than before, and of course it works. So as you see by now, many of the features of ES6 simply allow us to do things that we can already do in ES5, but in a much better, quicker, and easier way. And this is, of course, one of these new features that doesn't allow us to do anything really new, but simply allows us to do something in a better way. Alright, so let's now quickly move on to the second lecture about parameters, which is default parameters. So, I showed you rest parameters in the last lecture, so now it's time to talk about default parameters. And default parameters are actually a very straightforward concept. We use them whenever we want one or more parameters of a function to be preset, so we want them to have a default value. So ES6 brings us default parameters, but there is also a way of coding this in ES5. So let's start by doing that. So we haven't used function constructors in a long time, so let's do that now and create a person. Okay, but we create specifically a Smith person, so a person which is a part of the Smith family. So let's call it Smith person, and we want it to have a first name, a year of birth, also a last name, and a nationality. All right. And so we say, as usual, should be the first name that we receive. The last name is, of course, the last name, and the same for the year of birth. And the nationality. Alright, so let's now use that function constructor and create a new person called John once more. So it's a new Smith person. Let's say John and 1990. So JavaScript actually allows us to call any function without specifying all of the arguments. So in this case, we only specify first name and year of birth, but leave the last name and nationality empty. And what JavaScript does in this case is that it simply assigns undefined to these two parameters. So they will be undefined. And we're going to make use of that in a second. I just want to show it to you here in the console. Okay, so let's take a look at John. And so here we see, so last name is undefined and the nationality is undefined as well. So what if we wanted to add a default for the last name and for the nationality? So imagine that we always would call this function constructor like this, only with the first name and the year of birth, and that the last name and the nationality would be default. And we can actually do that and make use of the fact that the arguments that we don't specify will be undefined. And so we can then use an if statement or something simpler like the ternary operator and simply say, if the last name is undefined, then let the last name be Smith. and else it's simply last name, so nothing changes. So let's think about it again. So the variable will be undefined if we do not specify the last name, okay? And so in this case, last name will become Smith. And that makes sense because we say that it's a Smith person here, right? And in case that it's not undefined, then nothing happens. And we can actually delete this part from here. And we'll now do the same thing with the nationality. So if the nationality is undefined, then we want the nationality to be, let's say, American. All right. And then after that, this part of the code here will execute and do its work. So let's see what happens now. Okay, so we have a small bug here, and the problem is actually that in the ternary operator, we also have to always specify the else part. So let's just say that in this case, it's last name equal last name. So it doesn't make much sense, but we have to put the else part here as well. And so here, let's say nationality is the nationality. Okay. So let's now take a look at John again. And yeah, so his last name is not Smith and his nationality is American. So we only called the Smith person operator function constructor with 2 arguments, but we still have all of these 4 properties of the object well defined because we implemented something similar to default parameters. Now, these can of course be overwritten. So imagine that we have another person, which is Emily, and Emily is John's sister, and she married with someone else and moved to Spain. And so we can now, of course, specify a new last name and a new nationality. So let's say that we have also a Smith person. She's called Emily. Let's say born in 1983, but her last name is now no longer Smith, but Diaz, so she moved to Spain and is now Spanish and no longer American. And so this is going to override the default parameters of our function constructor. So if we now take a look at Emily, of course, the defaults were overwritten and we now have the last name as Diaz and the nationality as Spanish. So this is how we use something like default parameters in ES5. And now we're ready to see how this actually works in ES6, which is a lot easier and straightforward. So now in ES6, all we have to do is, of course, this part is the same. So it's a Smith person. And we have a first name, a year of birth. And now this is where we define the default parameter. So we say that the last name should be Smith and that the nationality should be American if we do not specifically say something else. Then of course this part here is the same. So I will just copy it. And that's it. So we don't need any of this part here. All we need to do is to specify the default parameters right here where we actually declare the parameters. Okay. So if we now run this and take a look at John, then this is exactly what we had before, but in a better and easier way. So Smith again here, of course, and he is American. And the same with Emily. So we overrode the defaults, and so her last name is Diaz, and she is Spanish. Okay? So REST and default parameters definitely makes it easier to work with functions in JavaScript. So they are a very welcome addition to the language. Okay, so let's now move on.